This trap occurs after white move pawn to c4, initiating the English opening. The game progresses as follows. White plays knight to c3, and black responds with knight to c6. White then develops the knight to f3, followed by black's move pawn to g6. So far, all these moves are fairly standard in this opening. White continues with pawn to d4, and black captures on d4. At this point, black expects white to recapture the pawn with the knight, which is the most natural and logical move. However, white can opt for a more aggressive strategy by playing knight to d5. Although this move might not seem immediately threatening, it targets some of black's weaknesses. Its purpose will become clear shortly. Black responds with bishop to g7, setting the stage for a tactical opportunity for white. This is the continuation of the airplane trap. White proceeds with the move bishop to g5, creating significant pressure on black's position. The combined attack from the bishop and the knight makes black's position uncomfortable and difficult to defend. If black attempts to counter by playing pawn to f6, trying to drive the bishop away, white has a strong response. The bishop retreats, targeting the c7 square, now attacked twice by the knight and the bishop. To defend, black is forced to play pawn to d6, blocking the attack. White can then recapture the pawn on d4, securing a superior position. Black's king side structure has been weakened, and the bishop on g7 is rendered ineffective, blocked by black's own pawns. Additionally, white retains multiple threats, including the potential move knight to b5, aiming to capture the c7 pawn. Overall, white's position is highly advantageous, with black left to manage numerous weaknesses. In the actual game, however, Kraken did not play pawn to f6, which we analyzed earlier. Instead, black opted for the move knight g to e7, a typical choice for players unfamiliar with this opening line. While knight g to e7 appears to be a natural and solid move for black, it is, in fact, a critical mistake that leads to a losing position. At this point, white can shock their opponent with the move knight takes d4. At first glance, this move might seem like a blunder, as black can capture the knight either with their own knight or the bishop. However, white is strategically winning in this position. If black ignores white's threat, white can proceed by trading off the knight on c6 and then capturing black's knight on e7. Either with the bishop or the knight. This sequence leaves white with a decisive advantage. You now have a strong threat on the board, forcing black to respond. Let's analyze black's options. If black captures the pawn on d4 with their knight, white can recapture by taking the knight on e7, and in doing so, white also traps black's queen on d8, leading to a decisive win for white. Thus, capturing on d4 with the knight is not a viable option for black. In the game, Kraken chose to take on d4 with the bishop, which seems like a logical and sound option. However, this is where white can unleash a shocking surprise. Queen takes d4. By sacrificing the entire queen, white sets up a winning position on the next move. What's the idea behind this queen sacrifice? First, the queen is attacking black's rook, forcing black to respond. If black captures the queen, white plays knight to f6 and then proceeds with knight to f8. At this point, it's completely justified to finish the game in style with the move bishop to h6, delivering a stunning checkmate. Here is the main line initiating the English opening. This demonstrates how effective these traps can be, even against experienced opponents. The game proceeds as follows. After g3, black develops with bishop to b4, and white responds with knight to d5. This move immediately puts pressure on black, forcing them to make a decision. If black does nothing, white will happily capture the bishop. To avoid this, black might decide to trade knights. After the exchange, black's knight becomes vulnerable. If the knight retreats, white can potentially capture the pawn on e5, leaving black in trouble. In an attempt to counterattack, black might play pawn to e4, attacking white's knight while white's knight attacks black's. At first glance, this seems like a strong response. However, after the pawn exchange, instead of continuing to trade pawns, white can deliver a surprising blow with queen to b3. At this point, black realizes they are in a losing position, with threats they cannot adequately defend. Even though the game has just begun, it's already time for black to resign. The queen is now attacking the bishop, but more importantly, it exerts indirect pressure on the b7 pawn. Once the bishop retreats, white can capture the b7 pawn, gaining additional material. Black cannot keep their bishop on b4 indefinitely. They might delay with a move like queen to e7, but white will eventually drive the bishop away with pawn to a3. Once the bishop retreats, white can secure the b7 pawn and potentially target other black pieces. On the next move, white is bound to capture one of black's key pieces, leaving black with no reasonable options. At this stage, it's time for black to resign. Countering this trap: if your opponent tries to trap you as we just discussed, you can turn the tables by setting a counter trap. After the initial classical moves of the English opening, white might follow the same line by playing knight to d5. After the exchange, we saw earlier that black's pawn to e4 counterattack does not work. It actually leads to a losing position. Instead, black can play a surprising move, knight to d4. At first, it looks like black is giving up the pawn on e5, as if there's no way to defend it. However, this is a clever trap. If white greedily captures the pawn, black responds with queen to e7, creating a dangerous situation for white. If white moves their knight, it doesn't matter where. Let's say knight to d3, black finishes the game with knight to a3, delivering a stunning checkmate. The pawn on b2 cannot capture the knight because it is pinned by black's queen, making this tactic particularly effective. If white realizes the knight cannot retreat, they might try to protect it with pawn to f4. However, black can simply play pawn to d6, attacking the knight again. Eventually, white's knight is forced to retreat, leaving black with a strong advantage. Let's consider the scenario where white plays knight to d3. If black responds with a check using knight to f3, white's king can escape by playing king to f2, rendering this approach ineffective. Instead, black can proceed with the move queen to e4, attacking the rook on h1 and threatening to capture it on the next move. White's only way to save the rook is to play rook to g1. But this sets up an extraordinary response from black. The brilliant and almost inhuman move is queen to e3. This is a shocking and brutal move that might make your opponent reconsider their chess career. The pawn on f2 is pinned and cannot capture the queen, leaving white in a hopeless position. The main threat is knight to f3, delivering an unstoppable checkmate. This setup is truly insane. It's rare to see a checkmating combination where the queen appears to sacrifice itself on e3, even though it isn't truly a sacrifice due to the pin. White has no way to prevent knight to f3, and if they attempt to delay the inevitable, black can simply capture the rook on g1. At this point, white has no viable moves, and it's time for them to resign. Another variation of this trap begins with the same opening moves: pawn to c4, English opening, followed by pawn to e5, knight to c3, and knight to f6. This leads to the same position we've analyzed previously. At this point, we discussed the move knight to d4, which sets a countertrap for black. If you are playing as white, remember not to capture the pawn on e5, as it is a poisoned pawn. An alternative for black to avoid losing the pawn on e5 is to play knight to e7, counter-attacking white's knight on d5. After exchanging pawns, white can play queen to b3, which creates pressure on black's position. The queen attacks the knight, and the knight cannot move without losing the bishop on b4. To address this, black must protect their knight. White can then continue with bishop to g2, increasing the pressure on the knight and threatening to capture it. Afterward, white can target the bishop on b4 as well. Black is forced to protect both pieces. The correct move for black in this situation is queen to e7, defending the bishop. This leads to an approximately equal position, though white remains more active. However, if black plays the seemingly more straightforward move queen to a5, attempting to protect both the knight and the bishop, they fall into a losing position. White can respond with pawn to e4, shifting the angle of the attack. Now, black realizes that the knight cannot move, as doing so would allow white to capture the pawn on f7 with devastating consequences. If black tries to save the knight, white can capture the pawn on f7, followed by the pawn on g7. At this point, black's position collapses as white's attack targets multiple pieces and pawns. Black is left with no good moves and is forced to resign.